The rain was relentless that night, hammering the roof of the house I'd called home for 42 years. I sat in the living room, my hands folded in my lap, the weight of 68 years pressing into my bones. My name is Margaret, and I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to feel like a stranger in her own life. But there I was, staring at the faded wallpaper, listening to my son Thomas tell me I was no longer welcome. "Mom," he said, his voice sharp like a blade slicing through the quiet, "this house isn't yours anymore. You're a financial burden, and we can't keep carrying you." His wife Claire stood behind him. Her arms crossed her lips, pursed in a way that told me she'd rehearsed this moment. My heart cracked open not because of the words, but because of the man who said them. My boy, the one I'd rocked to sleep, the one I'd stayed up nights praying for when he was sick. He was 40 now, a stranger in a suit, his eyes cold as the rain outside. I didn't cry. Not then. I'd learned long ago that tears don't fix what's broken. Instead, I looked at him, searching for the boy who used to cling to my hand at the park, the one who'd laugh when I burned the cookies, but eat them anyway. He was gone. In his place was a man who saw me as a line item in a budget, a problem to be solved. Claire shifted her weight, her high heels clicking on the hardwood floor I'd scrubbed 1,000 times. "Margaret," she said, her voice syrupy with false concern. "We just think it's time you moved somewhere. Smaller. Somewhere you won't have to worry about upkeep or bills." She meant a nursing home. She didn't say it, but I saw it in her eyes. The way they darted to the pill bottles on the coffee table, my heart medication, my arthritis pills. The quiet evidence of a body that had carried me this far but was starting to falter. I wanted to scream to tell them this house was mine, paid for with years of sacrifice, with the sweat of my late husband Henry and the dreams we'd woven together. But my voice stayed trapped in my throat, heavy as the grief I'd carried since Henry died 10 years ago. Thomas didn't look at me. He stared at his phone, scrolling through something as if dismissing his own mother was just another task to check off. "Your medical bills are eating us alive," he added, not even glancing up. "We can't keep footing the cost." That was the moment I felt it, a wound deeper than the first, a betrayal that cut through the love I'd poured into him. My pills, the ones that kept my heart beating, were a burden. I was a burden. The rain kept falling a steady drum against the windows, and I thought of the nights I'd sat in this very room knitting blankets for Thomas's children, the grandchildren who barely knew me now. I'd raised him alone after Henry's heart attack, stretching every penny, working as a seamstress until my fingers ached all, so Thomas could go to college, could have the life I never did. And now, here he was, standing in the home I'd built, telling me it wasn't mine anymore. I stood up, my knees creaking, and walked to the fireplace mantel where a photo of Henry and me smiled back from our wedding day. I touched the frame, feeling the weight of his absence. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Thomas nodded, already turning toward the door, Claire trailing behind him like a shadow. They left without a goodbye, their car lights fading into the wet night. I stood there alone, the house creaking around me like an old friend. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't new. It had been creeping in for years, ever since Thomas married Claire, ever since my role as mother, as grandmother, as Margaret had been reduced to an inconvenience. I walked to the kitchen, my slippers soft against the floor, and picked up the phone. Not to call Thomas, not to beg or plead, but to call someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Lillian, my oldest friend, the one who'd known me before I was a wife, a mother, a widow. I didn't know why I dialed her number. Not then. Maybe I just needed to hear a voice that didn't see me as a burden. Lillian answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar like a quilt draped over my shoulders. "Margaret." "Is that you?" she asked, and I felt tears prick my eyes for the first time that night. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I just said, "I need to talk." And she listened the way only someone who's walked through life with you can. We talked until the rain slowed, until the clock on the wall chimed midnight. When I hung up, I felt something shift inside me, not hope, not yet, but a flicker of something I'd forgotten I could feel. I looked around the kitchen at the chipped mugs Henry and I used to drink from at the table where I'd taught Thomas to write his name. This was my home, my life, and I wasn't ready to let it go. The next morning, I woke to a gray sky, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. I made coffee the same way I had every morning for decades and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. My hands trembled as I wrote, not from fear, but from a quiet resolve. I didn't know what I was planning, not exactly, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. Thomas's words echoed in my mind. Financial burden, medical bills, not yours anymore. Each one was a stone in my chest, but I wasn't going to let them crush me. I wrote down everything I'd given him over the years, not just money, but time, love, the pieces of myself I'd carved out to make him whole. And then I wrote something else, a phone number scrawled on a card tucked in my drawer. A lawyer. Henry's old friend Arthur, who'd handled our affairs years ago. I didn't know why I thought of him, but I felt it in my gut. Something was coming. Something I needed to be ready for. I spent the day sorting through papers, old bank statements, the deed to the house. My name was on it, clear as day, but Thomas didn't know that. He assumed, like so many do, that an old woman like me was just a guest in her own life. I found other things, too. Letters from Henry, a savings account I'd forgotten about, a life insurance policy he'd taken out before he died. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And it was more than Thomas thought I had. I didn't call Arthur that day or the next. I wasn't ready. But I kept his number close like a talisman, and I started to feel the edges of a plan forming something that would remind my son and myself who I really was. The days passed, each one a little heavier than the last. Thomas didn't call, didn't check on me. Claire sent a text, curt and impersonal. "Have you thought about our talk?" I didn't respond. Instead, I walked through the house, touching the things that anchored me. The quilt I'd made for Thomas's crib, the rocking chair where I'd sung him to sleep. I thought about the years I'd spent building this life, the love I'd poured into it, and the way it had been dismissed in a single conversation. I thought about my pills, the ones Thomas mocked, and the way they kept me here fighting, breathing, living. And I thought about Henry, who'd always said I was stronger than I knew. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel both alone and alive. A young girl from down the street, Rosie, rode by on her bike, waving at me like she always did. "Hi, Miss Margaret," she called, her smile bright as the sun set. I waved back, and for a moment I felt seen. Not as a burden, not as an old woman, but as Margaret. Just Margaret. I watched her pedal away, her laughter echoing, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to disappear. Not for Thomas, not for Claire, not for anyone. I picked up the phone and dialed Arthur's number. When he answered, his voice steady and kind, I said, "I need your help. I want to make a will." The days after I called Arthur felt like walking through fog, everything familiar but blurred, heavy, with a quiet that wasn't peaceful, but suffocating. I'd wake each morning in the same bed I'd shared with Henry, the same bed where I'd dreamed of a future that now felt like a lie. My name is Margaret, and at 68, I was learning what it meant to be invisible, not just to Thomas and Claire, but to the world I'd built around me. The phone didn't ring. The doorbell stayed silent. Even the neighbors who used to stop by with casseroles after Henry died had moved on with their lives, their own families, their own stories. I was a ghost in my own home, haunting rooms filled with memories no one else seemed to care about. I tried to keep busy. I'd dust the shelves, water the geraniums on the porch, mend the hem of a dress I hadn't worn in years. But every task felt hollow, like I was trying to convince myself I still mattered. Thomas's words, financial burden, looped in my mind, a cruel refrain that grew louder in the quiet. I'd catch myself staring at my pill bottles lined up like soldiers on the kitchen counter and wonder if he was right. Maybe I was costing too much. Maybe I was taking up space that didn't belong to me anymore. The thought made my chest ache, not from my heart condition, but from something deeper, something no medicine could touch. One morning, I found myself at the dining room table sorting through a box of old photos. There was Thomas at 5, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a fish he'd caught with Henry. There was me younger, my hair still dark, laughing as I pushed him on a swing. And there was Henry, his arm around me, his eyes crinkling with a love that had carried me through the hardest years. I traced his face with my finger, wishing he were here to tell me what to do. He'd always said I was the strong one, but I didn't feel strong. I felt broken, discarded like an old chair left on the curb. I was startled by a knock at the door. For a moment, my heart leapt. Maybe Thomas had come to apologize to say he didn't mean it. But when I opened the door, it was Lillian, my friend from years ago, the one I'd called that rainy night. She stood there, her silver hair pulled back, a grocery bag in one hand, and a smile that felt like sunlight. "I figured you could use some company," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I hadn't seen her in person since Henry's funeral, but she moved through my kitchen like no time had passed, unpacking apples, a loaf of bread, a jar of her homemade peach jam. "Sit," she said, pointing to a chair. "I'm making tea." I sat watching her bustle around, and something in me loosened. Lillian didn't ask me to explain myself, didn't pry about Thomas or the house. She just talked about her garden, her cat, the new librarian who kept shushing everyone. And then, as she set a steaming mug in front of me, she said, "You don't have to tell me what's wrong, Margaret, but you don't have to carry it alone either." Her words were gentle, but they landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the numbness I'd wrapped myself in. I didn't tell her everything, not then. But I told her enough about Thomas's words, about Claire's cold stare, about the way my own son had made me feel like a stranger. Lillian listened, her eyes steady, her hand resting on mine. When I finished, she didn't offer platitudes or tell me it would be okay. Instead, she said, "You're still Margaret, the woman who raised a boy on her own, who kept this house standing when the world tried to knock it down. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Her words were a lifeline, fragile but real, and I clung to them. That afternoon, Lillian stayed, and we talked until the light faded. She told me about her own life, how her daughter had moved across the country, how she'd learned to fill the emptiness with small joys like planting roses or volunteering at the community center. "You don't have to be who they expect you to be," she said. "You get to decide who Margaret is now." I didn't have an answer, not yet, but her words planted a seed, something small and stubborn that refused to die. The next day, I woke with a purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't grand or dramatic, just a need to do something to prove I wasn't as useless as Thomas thought. I started in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower beds Henry had loved. My hands ached, my back protested, but I kept going, the dirt under my nails, a reminder that I was still here, still capable. Rosie, the girl from down the street, rode by on her bike and stopped, her ponytail bouncing. "What you doing, Miss Margaret?" she asked, leaning over the fence. I smiled, wiping sweat from my brow. "Just waking this garden up," I said. She grinned and ran off, but a few minutes later she was back holding a handful of daisies from her own yard. "For you," she said, thrusting them at me. I took them, my throat tight, and for the first time in days I felt a spark of warmth. That evening I met with Arthur the lawyer. His office was small, cluttered with books and papers, but his eyes were kind. The same eyes that had helped Henry and me navigate our mortgage years ago. I told him I wanted to make a will to put my affairs in order. I didn't mention Thomas or the house, not yet. I just said I want to make sure things are clear. For me. Arthur nodded, no judgment, no pity. He asked questions about the house, the savings, the life insurance, and I answered, surprised by how much I knew, how much I'd held together over the years. When I left, I felt a little taller, a little steadier, like I'd taken a step towards something solid. The days that followed were quiet, but not as heavy. I started small routines: coffee on the porch, a walk to the mailbox, a call to Lillian to share a laugh. I kept sorting through the house, not to pack it up, but to reclaim it. I found an old journal of Henry's tucked in a drawer filled with notes about our life together. One entry, dated a year before he died, read, "Margaret is the heart of this home. Always will be." I read it over and over, tears blurring the ink, and I realized I'd been letting Thomas's words drown out Henry's. I wasn't a burden. I was the woman who'd built this life, who'd loved fiercely, who'd survived loss, and kept going. One afternoon, I was in the attic sorting through boxes when I found something that stopped me cold: a folder of bank statements, not mine, but Henry's. They were from an account I didn't recognize one he'd set up before he died. The balance wasn't huge, but it was enough to change things enough to remind me I had options. I sat there, the folder in my lap, and felt a shift. Not anger, not yet, but a clarity I hadn't known I'd lost. Thomas didn't know about this account. Neither did Claire. And for the first time, I realized I held something they couldn't take. I didn't tell anyone, not even Lillian. But I called Arthur and asked him to look into it to make sure it was mine, to help me understand what it meant. He promised to check, his voice calm but curious, and I hung up, feeling like I'd lit a match in the dark. I wasn't ready to confront Thomas, not yet. I wasn't even sure what I wanted, but I knew I wasn't going to let him erase me. I started writing again, not just lists or plans, but letters to Henry, to the Margaret I used to be, to the woman I was becoming. They weren't for anyone else, just for me, a way to remember who I was when the world tried to forget. Rosie came by again this time with a drawing, a picture of me in the garden surrounded by flowers. "You look happy here," she said, and I hugged her, my heart full in a way I hadn't thought possible. I hung the drawing on the fridge next to a photo of Henry, and I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to disappear. Not for Thomas, not for Claire, not for anyone. I was Margaret, and I was still here. The weeks slipped by like pages in a book I wasn't sure I wanted to read. Each morning I woke to the same quiet house, the same ache in my chest that wasn't just my heart condition, but the weight of being unwanted. My name is Margaret, and at 68, I was learning to live in a world where my own son saw me as a problem to be solved. Thomas hadn't called since that rainy night, hadn't checked to see if I was okay, if I was even still here. Claire sent another text, sharp and impersonal. "We need to know your decision soon." I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen, but I didn't reply. Instead, I set the phone down and walked to the window, watching the world move on without me. The loneliness was a living thing curling around me in the quiet moments when I ate dinner alone, when I passed Thomas's old room, when I saw families laughing in the park across the street. I'd always been the one to hold things together, to mend the tears in our family's fabric, but now there was no one to mend me. I thought about my grandchildren, Lily and Max, who used to run to me with sticky hands and bright smiles. They were teenagers now, caught up in their own lives, and Claire made sure I was a footnote in theirs. "They're busy," she'd say when I asked to see them, her tone final, like I was asking for something I didn't deserve. But there were moments, small and fragile, that kept me from sinking. Lillian became my anchor, calling every few days, dropping by with stories that made me laugh until my sides hurt. One afternoon, she dragged me to the community center for a painting class, something I hadn't done since I was a girl. My hands shook as I held the brush, my arthritis making the lines wobbly, but Lillian just grinned and said, "It's not about perfection, Margaret. It's about showing up." I painted a clumsy sunflower, its petals uneven but bold, and when I hung it in the kitchen, I felt a flicker of pride. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Rosie, the girl from down the street, kept showing up too. She'd knock on my door with treasures, a shiny rock, a feather, a story about her day. One day, she asked me to teach her how to knit, and we sat on the porch, my old needles clicking in her small hands. "You're good at this, Miss Margaret," she said, her tongue poking out as she focused. I smiled, my heart swelling. She didn't see me as a burden or an old woman. She saw me as someone who mattered. I gave her a skein of blue yarn to keep, and when she hugged me, I held on a little longer than I meant to. Arthur called with news about the account I'd found in Henry's papers. It was real, he said, a savings account Henry had set up for me, separate from the family's finances. The balance wasn't life-changing, about $20,000, but it was enough to give me choices. "It's in your name," Margaret, Arthur said. "No one else can touch it." I sat with that knowledge, turning it over like a smooth stone in my hand. Thomas didn't know. Claire didn't know. And for the first time, I felt a quiet power, not in anger, but in knowing I wasn't as helpless as they thought. I started making changes, small but deliberate. I called the pharmacy and set up a payment plan for my medications, using my own savings to cover what insurance didn't. It wasn't easy, but it meant I didn't have to rely on Thomas's begrudging checks. I stopped answering Claire's texts, letting her words pile up unread. I wasn't ready to confront them, but I was done letting them control me. I spent evenings writing in my journal, pouring out the hurt, the anger, the love I still carried for the boy Thomas used to be. Some nights I'd read Henry's old letters, his words reminding me of the woman I'd been strong, capable, loved. One morning I decided to clean out the garage, a task I'd avoided since Henry died. It was filled with his things tools, fishing gear boxes of papers he'd never sorted. My back ached as I moved boxes, but I kept going, driven by a need to reclaim something, anything. I found an old watch of his, a simple silver thing he'd worn every day. I held it to my ear, listening for the faint tick that was long gone, and then slipped it on my wrist. It was too big sliding against my skin, but it felt right, like carrying a piece of him with me. I wore it every day after that, a quiet rebellion against the idea that my life was over. Lillian noticed the watch during one of her visits. "That's Henry's, isn't it?" she asked, her eyes soft. I nodded and she squeezed my hand. "He'd be proud of you, you know, for keeping on." I wanted to believe her, but the doubt still lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake. That evening, we sat on the porch sipping lemonade, and I told her about the account, about Arthur, about the will I was starting to plan. She listened, her face serious, and then said, "You're not just protecting yourself, Margaret. You're protecting who you are. Don't let them take that." Her words stayed with me, echoing in the quiet moments. I started looking at the house differently, not as a place I might lose, but as a testament to everything I'd built. I fixed a leaky faucet myself, using Henry's old tools, cursing under my breath when the wrench slipped. I laughed when I finally got it right, the sound startling in the empty house. I planted new flowers in the garden ones. I chose not the ones Claire had once suggested. Each act was small, but together they were a chorus singing back to me, "You are still here. You are still Margaret." One afternoon, I was at the grocery store picking out apples when I overheard two women talking. My mother-in-law's moving in one said, her voice heavy with resentment, "It's going to be such a burden." The word hit me like a slap, and I froze the apple in my hand, suddenly too heavy. I wanted to turn around to tell her I wasn't a burden, that none of us were, that we were people with lives and loves and stories, but I didn't. I put the apple in my cart and walked away, my heart pounding. That night, I wrote in my journal, "I am not a burden. I am Margaret. I am enough." Arthur called again this time with a draft of the will. He'd included the house, the savings, everything I'd asked for, but he also asked a question I wasn't ready to answer. Who do you want to leave it to, Margaret? I didn't know. Not Thomas, not after what he'd done. Not Claire, who'd never seen me as anything but an obstacle. But the thought of leaving it to no one, of letting my life's work vanish, was unbearable. I told Arthur I'd think about it, and he didn't push. "Take your time," he said. "This is yours to decide." That evening, Rosie came by with another drawing, this one of the two of us knitting on the porch. "You're my favorite person to visit," she said, her eyes bright. I hugged her, my throat tight, and realized I did have someone who saw me, someone who cared. I didn't know if she'd be part of the will, but she was part of my life, and that was enough for now. I hung the drawing next to the sunflower painting, a gallery of small victories, and I felt something shift. Not hope, not yet, but a stubborn refusal to let Thomas's words define me. I started going to the community center, more not just for painting, but for the company. I met other women my age, women who'd been through their own betrayals, their own losses. We didn't talk about it directly, but we understood each other, sharing coffee and stories, laughing over nothing. One woman, Helen, told me she'd sold her wedding ring after her husband left her, using the money to take a trip to Paris. Best thing I ever did, she said, her eyes sparkling. I didn't have a ring to sell, but I had my account, my house, my will, and I had me. The loneliness didn't vanish, but it grew quieter, drowned out by the small acts that filled my days. I was still Margaret, still here, still fighting. And with every step, I was building something new, not just a will, but a life that was mine, no matter what anyone else thought. The air was turning crisp, the kind of autumn chill that makes you pull your sweater a little tighter. I'd always loved this time of year, the way the leaves burned red and gold, the way the world seemed to pause before winter's weight settled in. My name is Margaret, and at 68, I was starting to see myself again, not through Thomas's eyes or Claire's disdain, but through my own. The loneliness still lingered, a shadow that followed me through the house, but it wasn't as heavy now. I was learning to fill the quiet with pieces of myself I'd forgotten, pieces I was determined to reclaim. Every morning I'd sit on the porch with my coffee, Henry's watch ticking softly on my wrist, and watch the neighborhood wake up. Rosie would ride by on her bike, waving like I was the highlight of her day, and I'd wave back, my heart lifting. Those small moments were like stitches slowly mending the tears Thomas's words had left. Financial burden. The phrase still stung, but I was starting to see it for what it was. A lie, a weapon meant to shrink me. I wasn't shrinking anymore. I was growing quietly, like the roses I'd planted in the garden, their buds just starting to open. I'd been meeting with Arthur more often, his office a safe haven where I could speak without fear of judgment. We'd finalized the basics of the will, the house, the savings account, the life insurance policy, but I still hadn't decided who would inherit it. The question hung over me, heavy but not urgent. Arthur never pushed, just listened as I talked about the house, about Henry, about the life I'd built. One day, he leaned back in his chair, his glasses perched on his nose, and said, "Margaret, this isn't just about money or property. It's about what you want your legacy to say." His words stayed with me, turning over in my mind like leaves in the wind. My legacy. I hadn't thought of it that way, but he was right. This was my chance to say who I was not, who Thomas thought I should be. I started making bolder choices, ones that felt like claiming ground. I sold an old dining table Henry and I had never used, its wood too heavy for the life I lived now. The money wasn't much, but I used it to buy a new easel for the community center's painting class, donating it anonymously. Lillian caught me smiling when we set it up, and she raised an eyebrow. "You're up to something, Margaret," she said, her voice teasing. I just shrugged, but inside I felt a spark. Giving, even in a small way, reminded me I had something to offer, something the world still needed. The community center became my refuge. I went twice a week now, not just for painting, but for the women I'd met: Helen, who'd gone to Paris; Ruth, who'd lost her son to addiction; Sarah, who'd started a book club after her husband died. We'd sit around a table, our hands busy with brushes or knitting needles, and share pieces of our lives. They didn't know about Thomas, not the details, but they knew the shape of betrayal, the weight of being dismissed. One day, Sarah looked at me, her eyes sharp, and said, "You've got a fire in you, Margaret. Don't let anyone put it out." I knotted my throat tight and kept painting a quiet landscape, all soft greens and blues, the kind of place I could imagine resting. At home, I kept sorting through the house, not to pack it up, but to make it mine again. I moved furniture, hung new curtains, burned an old letter from Claire that had demanded I downsize for the family's sake. The act was small, but as the paper curled into ash in the fireplace, I felt lighter, like I'd burned away a piece of her hold on me. I started wearing my old dresses again, the ones I'd tucked away after Henry died, their colors bright against the gray of my grief. I'd catch my reflection in the mirror and pause, surprised by the woman looking back, not old, not broken, but alive with eyes that still held stories. One evening, I found a box of Henry's old blueprints in the attic. He'd been an architect, not famous, but steady designing homes for families like ours. I spread the blueprints on the dining room table, tracing his careful lines, his notes in the margins. One set was for our house, every detail drawn with love. I realized sitting there that this house wasn't just a building, it was Henry's promise to me, our shared dream. Thomas had no right to take it, no matter what he thought I owed him. I called Arthur the next day and asked him to double-check the deed. "It's yours, Margaret," he confirmed, his voice firm. "No one can change that." I hung up my hands steady and added a note to my journal. "This house is mine. So am I." I started thinking about money differently, too. The savings account Henry left me wasn't just a safety net, it was power, a way to shape my future. I met with a financial advisor, a kind woman named Ellen, who treated me like a person, not a problem. She helped me move the account to a new bank, one Thomas didn't know about, and set up a small investment to grow it slowly. "You're in control now," Ellen said, and I believed her. I paid off the rest of my medical bills, not because Thomas had mocked them, but because I wanted to stand on my own. Every payment felt like a brick in a wall I was building around myself, a wall no one could tear down. Rosie kept coming by her visits, a bright spot in my days. One afternoon, she brought her mother, Anna, who thanked me for teaching Rosie to knit. "She talks about you all the time." Anna said, her smile warm. I invited them in for tea, and we sat in the kitchen laughing over Rosie's stories. Anna noticed the sunflower painting and asked about it, and I told her about the community center, about the women who'd become my lifeline. "You should come," I said, surprised by my own boldness. Anna nodded, and the next week, she was there painting beside me, her presence a reminder that I could still build connections, still matter to someone new. I started writing the will in earnest, not just with Arthur's help, but in my own words late at night, when the house was quiet. I didn't want it to be cold or legalistic. I wanted it to tell my story, to say what I'd stood for. I left small bequests to the community center, to Lillian, to Rosie's school for art supplies. But the big decisions, the house, the bulk of the savings I left, blank, still unsure. I knew I didn't want Thomas to have it, not after what he'd done, but cutting him out felt like cutting out a piece of myself. I wrote him a letter instead, one I never planned to send, pouring out the hurt, the love, the anger. "You were my world, Thomas," I wrote, "but I'm not your burden. I'm my own person, and I always will be." I sealed it and tucked it away, a weight lifted even if he'd never read it. One evening, I was in the garden pruning the roses when I saw Thomas's car pull into the driveway. My heart stuttered, not with hope, but with a wary resolve. He stepped out alone, his face tight like he was here on business. "Mom," he said, no warmth in his voice, "we need to talk about the house. Claire's found a place for you." I stood up, my pruning shears in hand, and looked at him. Really looked. He wasn't the boy I'd raised, not anymore. But I wasn't the woman he thought I was either. "Come inside," I said, my voice steady, and led him to the kitchen where my sunflower painting hung, where Henry's watch glinted on my wrist. I didn't know what he'd say, but I knew I was ready to answer, not as a burden, but as Margaret, whole and unbroken. The kitchen was warm, the scent of fresh coffee lingering as Thomas sat across from me at the table, his hands folded like he was negotiating a deal. My name is Margaret, and at 68, I was no longer afraid of his silences, his sharp edges, the way he looked at me like I was a problem to be managed. The sunflower painting hung on the wall behind me, Rosie's drawing taped beside it, and Henry's watch ticked softly on my wrist, grounding me. I'd spent weeks rebuilding myself, stitch by stitch, and now facing my son, I felt the strength of that work. Thomas's eyes flicked around the room, taking in the new curtains, the absence of the old dining table, the small signs that I was claiming this space as mine. He didn't comment on them. He just cleared his throat and said, "Mom, we've found a place for you. It's nice, affordable. You'll be comfortable. Comfortable." The word landed like a stone, heavy with condescension. He meant a nursing home, a sterile room where I'd be tucked away out of his life, out of his budget. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting on the table, and studied him. His suit was crisp, his hair neatly combed, but there was a tiredness in his eyes, a strain I hadn't noticed before. For a moment I saw the boy who'd cried when his goldfish died, the one I'd held until he fell asleep. But that boy was gone, buried under years of choices I couldn't understand. And the house I asked, my voice calm though my heart was pounding. He shifted, uncomfortable. "We'd sell it. Use the money to cover your care. It's the practical thing to do." Practical. Another word that cut reducing my life. Henry's life, our life, to numbers on a spreadsheet. I thought of the blueprints I'd found. Henry's careful lines, the love he'd poured into this home. I thought of the roses in the garden, the ones I'd planted, the ones that were blooming despite the autumn chill. I thought of Lily and Rosie, the women at the community center, all the small threads tying me to a life I wasn't ready to give up. "This is my home, Thomas," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not leaving." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw anger flash in his eyes, the same anger I'd seen that rainy night when he called me a burden. "Mom, you can't afford to stay here," he said, his tone sharp. "Your medical bills, the upkeep, it's too much. We're trying to help you. Help." The word was a lie, and we both knew it. I stood up, my knees creaking, and walked to the counter, pouring myself more coffee. I didn't offer him any. "I've managed my bills," I said, turning to face him. "I don't need your help." His eyes narrowed, disbelief flickering across his face. How he asked, almost a challenge. I didn't answer, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't owe him an explanation. The savings account, the payments I'd made, the life I was building, they were mine, not his, to dissect. He stood his chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over, Mom," he said, and left the door closing with a thud that echoed through the house. I stood there, the coffee mug warm in my hands, and felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was Margaret, and I was still here. That night, I wrote in my journal the words flowing like a river, "I am not his burden. I am not his problem. I am my own, and I will decide what comes next." I sealed the page with a press of my hand, then called Arthur. "I want to add something to the will," I said, "something specific." He listened as I explained, his silence thoughtful. And when I finished, he said, "I'll draft it tomorrow. You're sure about this?" I looked at the sunflower painting, at Rosie's drawing, at the life I was reclaiming. "I'm sure," I said. The next day, I went to the community center, my easel waiting for me like an old friend. Helen was there, her hands covered in paint, telling a story about her trip to Paris that made us all laugh. I painted a new picture, a single rose, its petals vibrant against a gray sky, thorns sharp but beautiful. Sarah leaned over, her eyes soft. "That's you, Margaret," she said, strong even in the storm. I smiled, my heart full, and realized she was right. I was finding my strength not in loud declarations, but in quiet choices, in the life I was building day by day. I started volunteering at the community center, helping with the art classes, teaching kids like Rosie how to hold a brush, how to see the world in color. It wasn't much, but it gave me purpose, a reason to get up each morning. One afternoon, a girl named Mia, shy and hesitant, painted a tiny bird, its wings spread wide. "It's flying away," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I knelt beside her, my arthritis protesting, and said, "Sometimes flying is the bravest thing you can do." She smiled, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a reminder that I could still make a difference even in small ways. At home, I kept making the house my own. I hung the rose painting in the living room where it caught the morning light. I sorted through more of Henry's things, keeping what mattered: a tie he'd worn to our anniversary, a book of poems he'd read to me, and donating the rest. Each choice felt like a step toward freedom, a way of letting go without losing myself. I wore Henry's watch every day now, its weight a comfort, a reminder of the love that had shaped me. I started cooking again, simple meals at first, then recipes I hadn't made since Henry was alive, his favorite pot roast, a lemon cake I'd perfected. The house smelled like home again, not just memories, but life. Lillian came over one evening bringing a bottle of wine and a story about her cat knocking over a vase. We sat on the porch, the air cool, the stars just starting to show. I told her about Thomas's visit, about the will, about the rose painting. She listened, her eyes steady, and when I finished, she said, "You're not just surviving, Margaret. You're thriving." I laughed, the sound surprising me, and realized she was right. I wasn't just holding on, I was growing, reaching for something new. Arthur sent me the updated will, and I read it carefully, my hands steady. I'd added a clause, something small but significant. Thomas would receive 5 cents, a symbolic gesture, a way of saying I hadn't forgotten him, but I wasn't giving him what he thought he deserved. The rest, the house, the savings, I left to the community center with a portion for Rosie's education, a thank you for the light she'd brought me. It wasn't revenge, though the thought of Thomas's face when he heard it gave me a flicker of satisfaction. It was justice, a way of honoring the woman I was, the life I'd built. One morning, I was in the garden tending the roses when Anna Rosie's mother stopped by. She'd started coming to the community center, her paintings bold and bright, and we'd grown close, sharing stories over coffee. "Rosie's been talking about college," she said, her voice wistful. "She wants to be an artist." I smiled, thinking of the bequest I'd made, the way it might help Rosie fly. "She'll be amazing," I said, and Anna nodded, her eyes shining. We stood there, the roses blooming around us, and I felt a sense of peace, not because everything was perfect, but because I was enough. I kept writing in my journal, not just about the hurt, but about the joy, the way the roses smelled, the sound of Rosie's laughter, the weight of Henry's watch. I was telling my story, not Thomas's, not Claire's, but mine. And with every word, every choice, I was becoming Margaret again, not a burden, not a ghost, but a woman with a life worth living. The autumn deepened, the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. I'd always found comfort in the way the seasons turned, each one a reminder that change was inevitable, that even the coldest days would pass. My name is Margaret, and at 68, I was learning to trust that truth, to see myself not as a woman diminished by betrayal, but as one reshaped by it. The house, once heavy with silence, hummed with a new rhythm, my rhythm built from small acts of courage, from the choices I made to reclaim my life. Thomas's words, financial burden, still echoed sometimes, but they were fainter now, drowned out by the sound of my own voice, my own story. I spent my mornings in the garden, my hands in the soil, tending the roses that had become my companions. They were stubborn, like me, blooming, even as the nights grew colder. Rosie would join me sometimes, her chatter filling the air as she helped me prune or water. "These are the prettiest flowers on the street, Miss Margaret," she said one day, her hands smeared with dirt. I smiled, brushing a leaf from her hair. "They're tough just like us," I said, and she grinned, her eyes bright with a future I was determined to help her reach. I hadn't told her about the will, about the bequest for her education, but I carried it like a secret flame, warming me when the loneliness crept in. The community center was my second home now, a place where I wasn't just Margaret the widow, the mother of an ungrateful son, but Margaret, the woman who taught kids to paint, who laughed with friends who mattered. I'd started leading a knitting circle, my old needles clicking alongside those of women who'd become my family. Helen with her Paris stories, Sarah with her quiet wisdom, Ruth whose grief mirrored mine but whose humor lifted us all. We'd sit in a circle, our hands busy, our stories weaving together like the scarves we made. One evening, Ruth looked at me, her eyes sharp, and said, "You're different, Margaret. Stronger. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." I knotted my throat tight and kept knitting the yarn soft against my fingers, a tangible reminder of the life I was building. Arthur called with the final draft of the will, his voice warm but serious. "It's ready whenever you are," he said. "I've included everything, the house, the savings, the bequests, the 5 cents for Thomas." I could hear the question in his pause, the unspoken, "Are you sure?" I looked around the kitchen at the rose painting, Rosie's drawings, the coffee mug I'd used for years, chipped, but still whole. I'm sure I said and meant it. The 5 cents wasn't cruelty, though I knew Thomas would see it that way. It was clarity, a line drawn between the love I'd given him and the respect he'd refused me. The rest, the house, the money, for the community center. Rosie's education was my legacy, a way of saying I'd been here, I'd mattered, I'd chosen myself. I started preparing for what came next, not with fear, but with a quiet resolve. I met with Ellen, my financial advisor, to review the savings account, now growing slowly in its new bank. She showed me how to set up a small trust for the community center, ensuring the art classes would continue long after I was gone. "You're leaving something beautiful behind," she said, her smile kind. I nodded, thinking of the kids like Mia, the shy girl who'd painted the bird of Rosie, who saw the world in colors I'd forgotten. I was leaving more than money. I was leaving possibility, a chance for others to find what I'd found, a way to keep going no matter what. At home, I kept making the house my own, each change a declaration. I painted the living room a soft blue, a color. Henry had loved my hands steady despite the ache in my joints. I hung new photos me with Lillian laughing at the community center, Rosie holding her first knitted scarf, the women from the knitting circle, their faces bright with joy. The house wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a living thing shaped by the woman I was becoming. I wore Henry's watch every day, its weight a reminder of his love, but also of my own strength, the strength he'd always seen in me. One afternoon, I was in the attic sorting through the last of Henry's things when I found a letter I hadn't seen before tucked inside a book of poems. It was in his handwriting, dated a month before he died. "Margaret," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, but you're still here, and that's what matters. You're the heart of our home, the strongest person I know. Don't let anyone make you forget that." I sat on the attic floor, the letter trembling in my hands, tears falling onto the page. I'd been carrying his words in my heart, but seeing them written in his careful script felt like a gift, a reminder that I'd been loved, that I was still worthy of love. I took the letter downstairs and placed it on the mantel next to our wedding photo. That night, I wrote in my journal not about Thomas or the hurt, but about Henry, about the life we'd built, about the woman I was now. "I'm still here," I wrote, "and I'm not done yet." The words felt like a vow, one I was keeping with every choice, every step. I started planning something new, something bold, a small art show at the community center showcasing the kids' work, my own paintings, the stories we'd all told through color and light. I didn't know if anyone would come, but it didn't matter. It was for us, for the women who'd carried me, for the kids, who reminded me to dream. Lillian helped me organize it, her energy infectious. We hung paintings, set up tables, baked cookies for the guests. Rosie was there, her eyes wide as she saw her drawings framed on the wall. "This is because of you, Miss Margaret," she said, hugging me. I hugged her back, my heart full, and realized she was right, but not in the way she meant. She was part of why I'd kept going, why I'd found the courage to stand tall. The show was a success, not because of the crowd, though people came, but because of what it meant. I stood in the middle of the room, my rose painting glowing under the lights, and felt like Margaret, whole and unbroken for the first time in years. A few days later, I got a call from Claire, her voice clipped, demanding. "Thomas says you're being unreasonable about the house," she said. "We're coming over tomorrow to settle this." I listened, my hand steady on the phone, and said, "Fine, come." I didn't argue, didn't explain. I hung up and called Arthur, asking him to be there to bring the will. He agreed, his voice calm but curious, sensing something was coming. I spent the evening in the garden, the roses glowing in the twilight, and felt a strange peace. I wasn't afraid of Thomas or Claire, not anymore. I was ready not for a fight, but for the truth. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, Henry's letter in front of me, and wrote one final entry in my journal. Tomorrow they'll see me. Not the burden they made me, but the woman I am. I'm Margaret, and I'm enough. I closed the journal, slipped Henry's watch onto my wrist, and went to bed, the house quiet around me, not with loneliness, but with the strength of a life reclaimed. The morning arrived with a quiet clarity, the kind that settles over you when you know a storm is coming, but you've already braced yourself. My name is Margaret, and at 68, I was no longer the woman who'd sat trembling under Thomas's cold words, no longer the mother who'd let her son's betrayal define her. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee. The rose painting glowed on the wall, and Henry's watch ticked steadily on my wrist, a reminder of the love that had anchored me, the strength that had carried me here. I moved through the house with purpose, setting out chairs in the living room, opening the curtains to let the autumn light spill in. Thomas and Claire were coming, and so was Arthur with the will that would change everything. I wasn't nervous, not anymore. I was ready. Arthur arrived first, his briefcase in hand, his eyes kind but serious. He'd been Henry's friend, then mine, and now he was the keeper of my truth. "You're sure about this, Margaret?" he asked, settling into a chair. I nodded, pouring him coffee. "I've never been sure," I said, my voice steady. He didn't smile, but there was a glint in his eyes, a quiet respect that made me stand taller. We didn't talk much after that, just sat in the soft hum of the house, waiting. I thought of the roses in the garden, their petals fierce against the chill, and felt the same fire in me. Not anger, not revenge, but a deep, unshakable dignity. Thomas and Claire pulled into the driveway just after 10, their car gleaming a stark contrast to the weathered charm of my home. They stepped out, Thomas in his usual suit, Claire in a tailored coat, her heels clicking as they approached the door. I opened it before they could knock my face, calm, my hand steady. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. Thomas's eyes flicked to Arthur, a flicker of unease crossing his face, but Claire's expression was all business, her lips tight as she surveyed the room. Mom Thomas began not bothering with pleasantries. "We need to finalize this. The nursing home is ready to take you next week. We'll handle the sale of the house." Claire nodded, adding, "It's the best option for everyone, Margaret. You'll see." I didn't respond, not yet. I gestured to the chairs I'd set out, the same ones Henry and I had bought for family dinners years ago. "Sit," I said, my voice firm but not harsh. They hesitated, then sat, Thomas's jaw tight, Claire's eyes narrowing as she noticed Arthur's briefcase. I took my seat across from them, Arthur beside me, and folded my hands in my lap, Henry's watch catching the light. "Before we discuss anything," I said, "there's something you need to hear." Thomas opened his mouth, but I raised a hand, silencing him not with force, but with the quiet authority I'd earned over months of rebuilding myself. He closed his mouth, and for the first time I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Arthur opened his briefcase and pulled out the will, its pages crisp, its weight heavy with the choices I'd made. "Margaret asked me to prepare this," he said, his voice steady, professional. "She's requested that I read it aloud in full before any decisions are made about the house or her future." Claire shifted her purse clutched tightly, and Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped as if bracing for a fight. Arthur began, his voice clear, each word deliberate. He listed the small bequests, first to the community center for art classes, to Lillian for her friendship to Rosie's school, for her education. Thomas's face stayed blank, but Claire's eyes darted to me, a flicker of surprise she couldn't hide. Then Arthur reached the part I'd been waiting for, the part that had kept me up nights, not with doubt, but with a fierce clarity. "To my son, Thomas." Arthur read, I leave the sum of 5 cents as a reminder of the value he placed on my presence in his life. The room went still, the air thick with a silence that felt alive. Thomas's face paled, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came. Claire's hand froze on her purse, her eyes wide, her composure cracking like thin ice. Arthur continued, his voice unwavering. The remainder of my estate, the house, the savings account, and all other assets will be placed in a trust for the community center, with a portion designated for the education of Rosie Martinez, a child who has shown me kindness and reminded me of my worth. Thomas found his voice hoarse and unsteady. 5 cents, he said, his eyes locked on me, not Arthur. This is a joke, right? You can't be serious. I met his gaze, my heart steady, my hands still. I'm very serious, I said, my voice soft but unyielding. You called me a burden, Thomas. You mocked my medicine, my life, my home. 5 cents is what you thought I was worth. So that's what you get. Claire's face flushed, her mouth opening, but I turned to her, my eyes sharp. And you, Claire, stood by him, planned this, pushed me out. You don't get to decide my worth anymore. I do. Arthur cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the will. There's more, he said, and I saw Thomas flinch, as if bracing for another blow. Arthur's voice grew quieter, more deliberate. Margaret has also requested that the following be read a letter addressed to the family detailing the history of this estate. He pulled out a separate page, one I'd written with care, my words not angry, but clear a testament to the truth. Arthur read, his voice carrying the weight of my story. This house was built by Henry and Margaret, paid for with their labor, their love, their dreams. It was never Thomas's to claim. The savings account established by Henry was Margaret's alone, a gift he left to ensure her independence. And the family business which Thomas currently manages was funded by a loan from Margaret, given in trust, never repaid. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the truth hung between us. Thomas's hands trembled, his face ashen, and Claire's eyes darted to him, her confidence unraveling. Alone, Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. You never said... I leaned forward, my voice steady, my eyes locked on his. I didn't say because I didn't need to. I gave it because I loved you, because I believed in you. But you forgot that, Thomas. You forgot me. Claire's hand reached for his, but he pulled away, his eyes fixed on the table, unable to meet mine. Arthur set the papers down, his job done, and looked at me. I nodded a silent thank you and stood my knees steady despite the weight of the moment. This house is mine, I said, my voice ringing clear. My life is mine. You don't get to decide where I go or what I do, not anymore. Thomas looked up, his face a mix of shock and something else, shame maybe, or regret. Claire's lips trembled, but she said nothing, her earlier certainty gone. I walked to the mantel where Henry's letter sat beside our wedding photo and touched it lightly, grounding myself in the love that had never faltered, even when my sons had. They left soon after, Thomas muttering something about needing time. Claire silent, her heels no longer clicking with confidence. Arthur stayed a moment longer, his hand on my shoulder. You did well, Margaret, he said. You stood your ground. I smiled, tired but whole, and saw him out. The house was quiet again, but not empty. It was full of me, my paintings, my roses, my story. I sat at the kitchen table, Henry's watch warm against my skin, and felt a peace I hadn't known I could find. The truth was out, not as revenge, but as justice, a way of saying I was here, I was Margaret, and I was enough. The days after Thomas and Claire left were quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the suffocating silence of loneliness, but the gentle hush of a life settled into itself. My name is Margaret, and at 68, I'd found a peace I hadn't known I could claim. The house felt lighter now, its walls no longer heavy with the weight of betrayal, but warm with the life I'd built, the choices I'd made, the woman I'd become. The rose painting hung in the living room, catching the morning light, and Henry's watch ticked softly on my wrist, a steady reminder of the love that had shaped me, the strength that had saved me. I wasn't the same Margaret who'd sat trembling under Thomas's words, who'd felt like a ghost in her own home. I was whole not because the hurt was gone, but because I'd learned to carry it without letting it define me. I spent my mornings in the garden, the roses still blooming despite the deepening autumn chill. Rosie would come by her bike, wobbling as she waved her laughter a melody that filled the air. One day, she brought me a small clay pot she'd made at school, painted with bright swirls of color. "For your flowers, Miss Margaret," she said, her eyes shining. I hugged her, my heart full, and placed the pot on the porch, where it held a single rose, cutting its roots just starting to take. I hadn't told her about the will, about the bequest for her education, and I didn't plan to, not yet. It was enough to know it was there, a seed planted for her future, a way of saying thank you for the light she'd brought into mine. The community center remained my refuge, a place where I wasn't just a name on a will, but a friend, a teacher, a woman with stories to share. The knitting circle grew new faces joining the familiar ones, Helen, Sarah, Ruth, and now Anna Rosie's mother, who'd become a friend in her own right. We'd sit in a circle, our needles clicking, our laughter weaving through the stories we told. One evening, Lillian looked at me, her eyes soft, and said, "You've done something extraordinary, Margaret. You've made a life that's yours." I smiled, my hand steady on the yarn, and realized she was right. This life, messy, hard-won, beautiful, was mine, and no one could take it away. Thomas didn't call, didn't come by, and I didn't expect him to. The will had been a line drawn, not just between us, but between the woman I'd been and the woman I was now. I didn't hate him, though the hurt still lingered sharp in quiet moments. I loved him the way a mother always will, but I didn't need his approval, his presence to feel whole. Claire sent a letter, stiff and formal, saying they were reassessing their plans and wished me well. I read it once, then burned it in the fireplace, watching the paper curl into ash, the last of her influence fading into nothing. I didn't forgive them, not fully, but I didn't carry their weight anymore. I'd set it down, and I was free. I kept writing in my journal, not about the past, but about the present. The way the roses smelled the sound of the kids' laughter at the community center, the feel of Henry's watch against my skin. Each entry was a testament to the life I was living, not for anyone else but for me. I painted more too, my canvases filling with colors I hadn't dared to use before, bold reds, deep blues, the hues of a woman who'd found her voice. The community center planned another art show, and I agreed to show my work not because I thought it was perfect, but because it was mine, a piece of my story. One afternoon, I was sorting through the attic, tying up the last loose ends of Henry's things, when I found a small velvet box tucked inside a coat pocket. Inside was a ring, not my wedding band, but a simple silver one with a tiny sapphire one Henry had given me early in our marriage when we were young and poor and dreaming of a future we couldn't yet see. I'd forgotten about it, lost in the years of raising Thomas, of building a life. I slipped it on my finger next to Henry's watch and felt a warmth spread through me, a connection to the girl I'd been, the woman I was now. I decided it wouldn't stay in a box anymore. It belonged in the world just like me. I gave the ring to Rosie the next day, not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet one, a passing of something precious. "This is for when you're older," I said, placing it in her small hand, "to remind you that you're strong, that you're enough." Her eyes widened and she hugged me, her arms tight around my waist. "I'll keep it forever, Miss Margaret," she said, and I believed her. I didn't need to pass it to Thomas, to Claire, to anyone who didn't see its worth. Rosie did, and that was enough. The weeks turned into months, the autumn giving way to winter's first frost. I kept volunteering, kept painting, kept knitting, kept living. The house was full of light, not just from the sun, but from the life I'd poured into it. The photos on the walls, the roses on the porch, the laughter of friends who filled its rooms. I'd become a grandmother, not to my own grandchildren who remained distant, but to Rosie, to Mia, to the kids at the community center who looked at me with eyes full of trust. I'd become a friend, a teacher, a woman who stood tall not because the world had been kind, but because I'd chosen to be kind to myself. One evening, as the first snow fell, I sat on the porch, a blanket around my shoulders, Henry's watch, and the memory of his letter keeping me warm. I thought about the journey I'd taken, the pain I'd carried, the strength I'd found. I thought about Thomas, about the 5 cents, about the will that had been my voice when I couldn't speak. I thought about the women watching this, the ones who'd felt discarded, unseen, unworthy. And I knew what I wanted to say to you, to every woman who's ever been called a burden, who's ever been told her life doesn't matter. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, by who stays or who leaves. It's measured by how you choose to honor yourself, by the small acts that stitch you back together, by the love you give to the world, even when it doesn't give it back. You are enough, not because someone says so, but because you are here, breathing, fighting, living. I learned that not easily, but truly. And I'm living it now every day in this house, in this life as Margaret. I stood the snow dusting my hair and walked to the garden where the roses slept under their winter blanket. I touched the soil cold but full of promise and made a final gesture, not for Thomas, not for Claire, but for me. I planted a new rose bush, one I'd chosen for its name, Resilience. It would bloom in spring, fierce and beautiful, a symbol of everything I'd become. I stepped back my breath, visible in the cold air, and smiled. The house glowed behind me, my home, my heart, my story. And I was at peace.